Welcome to the chair. I'm your host, Dr. Digby James Wren, and today we're going to be talking about fragmentation in Europe. So, what's been happening? What's been going on? Ukraine to the east and to the west, the United States to the south, North Africa and the Middle East, Eastern Mediterranean. Let's just say that Europe is surrounded. But what we're really saying here is that the pressures that are being applied from Donald Trump's policies and tariff and security, economic, the whole kit and caboodle, as they say. But also, obviously the Ukraine conflict, ongoing Ukraine conflict, and fear of Russia, contractions in their economies. That's driven by the fact that they don't have any energy, they don't have any minerals and resources of their own, so they're completely dependent on importing everything they require in order to power their economies, oil, gas, essential minerals, etc., etc. And then we also have to think about the fact that China too is applying pressure to Europe in the terms of their automotive industry, in terms of technology, in terms of finance, in terms of growth, and just the sheer sort of weight of China in the global economy these days. That also is affecting Europe. Uh, the French being kicked out of North Africa, along with the Germans and the Americans, that the Eastern Mediterranean is exploding with the Israelis, and of course, supporting the Israeli position. Turkey is taking enormous benefits out of the Ukraine war, becoming the new transit state while the Ukraine is blocked. And what's going to happen to the Ukraine? Well, the Ukraine is effectively partitioned. Now, is Russia going to go all the way to the Dnieper, to Kiev, to Dnipro, and then Kiev, effectively partitioning the country between Western interests and Russian interests? And I won't say just Russian interests, but let's go with BRICS and the global south, their interests. And because those are the continental trade routes. China's Belt and Road has established that, and that's been very successful. And why Europe wants to turn its back on that is really a great question. And I think the answer to that question is that the political elites in Europe are still living in some kind of Cold War fantasy that they grew up in, and they are so disconnected from their electorates that they've allowed themselves to be forced by actions, primarily instability from the United States, to unsettle their very comfortable positions, and they've allowed people like von der Leyen and Scholz, Starmer, and the three or four prime ministers before him in the UK, and others, particularly the Baltic states, and Kallas as a sort of foreign spokeswoman for the EU, to dominate. So this is the fragmentation of Europe. So now they're all just squabbling, and they can't agree on anything. But the only thing that they do agree on is, just generally speaking, that there's a fear of Russia, and that's been drummed up to a terrible extent. And also, ignoring the fact that so many of their publics are voting centre right, not far right. AFD and Le Pen and so forth in France, these are no longer what you would call far right parties. These are centre right parties, and they're supported by the United States. Interestingly enough, but the fact that they've tried to just eliminate them, or sort of just completely exclude them from the political processes in their own countries, is extremely damaging. And they need to focus on their economies, and the way to do that is to trade with North Africa, trade with China and Russia and Central Europe. And we should just talk about Central Europe just a little bit, in the sense that you can see that power has moved in Europe, is moving towards Hungary and Austria and Serbia and Czech Republic and Slovak Republic. So, a sort of an Austro-Hungarian renaissance of some sort. But that clearly tells us that power and wealth is moving across Europe towards, well, into the Ukraine, and specifically the Dnieper River. Now, this situation, where Ukraine's been split, it's become so emotional, and everybody's just, about, millions of people being killed. Well, that's not really true. It's not millions. It's probably 100 or 100,000, or maybe slightly more than 100,000. One remembers that in Afghanistan there was only 14,000 Russians killed, not hundreds of thousands like the Americans said so many times. So the number is much smaller than I think the Western press has been talking about. And then there's your other protagonist, or antagonist, I should say. It was Western media, who have, for some reason, just absolutely refused, or they're so in hock with the governing elites that are out of touch with publics, and they're just using this for scandal and for eyeballs. And they're not really thinking about the consequences of what they're doing. They're not reporting facts. In fact, one could go far enough to say that censorship in Western Europe and the United States, well, perhaps the United States with Elon Musk's free speech kind of deal and Trump talking about that too, perhaps that's going to lessen. But clearly in Western Europe and in the UK, there is still so much censorship, so much propaganda that's manipulating public opinion for these political elites that are all just now in fragile coalitions or lame ducks like Macron, that they're powerless to be able to do anything other than just talk up military and security problems. And this is what they're doing. And how are they going to finance this? They're so in debt. Now, the Germans are going to start putting out bonds to finance their rearmament. And von der Leyen talks about rearming Europe. Where are they going to find the money? Where's the money going to come from? And the answer is, if it does come from anywhere, it's going to be taken from the living standards of the bottom 50%. And the rich are going to get richer. The ones that own all the armaments companies, they're all fighting about it already. And they're saying who's going to get what? Which money is going to go to which Italian company, Spanish company, German company, etc. And that's what they're fighting about. They're not thinking about what they're really doing with their money. And clearly, the way to go here is to reopen trade as fast as possible, go back to cheap, clean energy on pipelines, diversify if you wish, but do it in a very sensible fashion. But cutting yourself off from both sources. Now, we just need to remember that the Suez crisis in 1956 was about energy coming through the Suez Canal from the Middle East, and the Ukraine war is about energy coming from Russia through Ukraine. And now they're going to squabble about the Ukraine as well, about its mineral rights, its energy rights. Trump has already said he wants quid pro quo for that. And I think you'll find one of our featured contributors in the Global Polarity podcast, YouTube channel, and Substack that we run. Professor Joseph Mahoney has talked about this, and there's a link here somewhere. And these problems for Europe, this fragmentation, it's the pressure, if you see, the pressure from the United States across the Atlantic, the pressure of Western sort of economic strength and expansion across Central Asia, into Central Europe and into Europe. Duisburg in Germany is where the Belt and Road runs directly into. How are they going to live without this? Now, let's talk about investment. There's been no investment in Europe for almost 20 years, and in the US is almost the same. And I think the US is a subject for another short talk later on this week. But let's just wrap up on the fragmentation of Europe. Further decline, further contractions in their economy are going to deliver big losses for living standards, especially for the lower 50% and the middle classes that are still in the 50 to, top 50 to 60%, 70%. But the rich are going to get much richer. That's where all that money is going to go. So whatever money is raised in Europe to rebuild their economies based on armaments is going to go into the pockets of the rich industrialists across Europe, and that's going to deliver worse living standards, as I've just said. And I think, as a final word, we should be really thinking about China, Russia, the BRICS, working with Europe to increase trade, technology transfers, joint ventures with Chinese companies, etc., to rebuild BMW and Mercedes and the car industries in France and Italy as well. I think this is going to be the trend, and we need to talk about semiconductors as well. It's the same thing. European tech is nowhere, and we've seen what's going to happen to American tech. All of these sanctions are just really giving impetus and catalyzing even greater efforts in China and other countries in ASEAN to be non-dependent on US technology. And that includes all of their social media and so forth and so on. And we know that, the whole idea that, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, all of those companies, they're monopolies. They literally are monopolies in all of the G7 or Western countries. And they complain so bitterly about China and India and other countries, but really, they're monopolies. And this all has to change in the future. And Europe has an opportunity here to turn a generational page. And if they don't do it, if their political elites don't do it, there is going to be further trouble in Europe. Great, great trouble in Europe. And my last word on this is that if you take a line and you draw a line straight through the Ukraine, down the Dnieper, and it goes straight down to Gaza and the Suez and the Eastern Mediterranean. So that is the line of fragmentation in the East. And the other line of fragmentation, as I said before, is across North Africa and the Mediterranean, and then the Atlantic with the United States. That is what's causing fragmentation in Europe, and the Europeans need to wake up.